Imagine tomorrow your name trending worldwide for all the wrong reasons. That's exactly what Elizabeth Bathory faces in the echoing corridors of history. Think you could stomach medieval justice? Spoiler, most modern people would faint before the real show even starts. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Also, post your location and local time. I'm curious where this tale is being eavesdropped from. As the room softens around you, lean back and allow this story to unfold. An experience unlike anything you've listened to until now. Elizabeth Bathory is born in 1560 into a world that smells of incense, iron, and political tension. The Bathory family isn't just any noble household, they are among the most powerful in Hungary, boasting wealth, military influence, and a lineage that makes cousins and allies alike nod with respect or fear. Imagine attending family dinners where the main entertainment is strategy talk and whispers of distant battles. Even as a child, Elizabeth is reportedly precocious and headstrong, exhibiting temperamental behaviors that unnerved both peers and tutors. Historians still argue whether these early signs hinted at cruelty or merely the rigidity expected of aristocratic girls raised under strict supervision. Her surroundings are a mix of luxury and pressure. Tutors teach her Latin, religion, and the subtle art of political manipulation, while servants scurry like shadows across cold stone floors. Fringe accounts suggest young Elizabeth had a fascination with poisons and minor injuries, testing remedies or reactions on small animals, a hobby both curious and darkly practical. Some modern commentators liken her childhood to an aristocratic lab experiment gone awry, where privilege allows unchecked eccentricities to flourish unnoticed. The Bathory family home is filled with tapestries depicting battles, ancestors in heavy armor, and allegories of virtue and sin. The contrast between noble ideals and Elizabeth's growing obsession with control over life, hers and others, creates an undercurrent of unease. Anecdotes claim she would watch servants struggle with daily chores, timing their inefficiency and occasionally rewarding them in unsettlingly arbitrary ways. Remember, this is a girl whose playroom included miniature mannequins and rudimentary medical tools, blurring the line between curiosity and cruelty. By the time Elizabeth reaches her late teens, she is married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier of some renown, sealing a political alliance as much as a personal relationship. The union is reportedly affectionate in a distant, formal way, though it thrusts her into a household where power, suspicion, and violence are not just lessons, they are currency. Her husband's frequent absences on military campaigns leave her to manage estates and servants, a liberty that will later be scrutinized with morbid fascination. Historians still argue whether these conditions created the infamous Blood Countess or merely exposed tendencies that might have remained dormant in a different context. Elizabeth's adolescence, as surreal as it sounds, mixes privilege with tiny seeds of isolation. She is educated, wealthy, and increasingly aware of the advantages of fear and control. Yet she is simultaneously subject to the social expectations of obedience, beauty, and comportment. It's an environment where curiosity is allowed, but empathy is optional. One quirky rumor notes that she had a pet tortoise she would watch for hours, sometimes giving it tiny baths in perfumed water, a detail that oddly foreshadows her later obsession with bathing, though in far more sinister contexts, as whispers of her temperamental and strange behaviors circulate in noble circles. A sense of foreboding settles over her household. Servants report being unsettled by her scrutinizing gaze, tutors note her insistence on control during lessons, and neighbors, perhaps with the first glimmer of rumor, begin to whisper about the Countess's peculiarities. These are small sparks, easily dismissed as eccentricity among the elite, but historians still argue whether they were the true first signs of the infamous acts that would define her legend. And just when you start picturing Elizabeth as another spoiled noblewoman, imagine the stone corridors of her future castle echoing with something far darker, a presence that's curious, calculating, and increasingly untethered from conventional morality. That's where this story truly begins, the point where a young woman of privilege tips over a threshold that history remembers with horror. The legacy of Elizabeth Bathory doesn't start with crimes that shock modern sensibilities. It starts with these early moments of intense observation, minor cruelty, and an obsessive will to control. And as she grows, those traits, nurtured in a gilded cage, prepare the stage for a series of events that will blur reality, rumor, and legend into something almost mythic. By the time she moves into the infamous Csejthe Castle, whispers have become rumors, rumors have become fearful glances, and the noble girl who once studied Latin and poetry will step fully into the shadow of infamy. But even here, at the very beginning of her adult life, the line between fact and fiction is thin. Historians still argue whether the early tales of her cruelty were embellished by jealous neighbors or were, chillingly, just the first chapter in a pattern that will become impossible to ignore. And just when you think you've understood her childhood, the darkness lurking in the corridors of her upbringing hints at what comes next. A world where a castle, servants, and power will combine into a story that the modern imagination struggles to digest. Somewhere in those stone walls, Elizabeth begins to test not only the limits of her authority, but the tolerance of human morality itself. And that's just the tip of the bloodied iceberg waiting to unfold. Csejthe Castle rises from the mist like a silent sentinel, its towers scraping the sky, and its stone walls carrying the chill of centuries. Elizabeth Bathory moves through its corridors as both mistress and phantom, her presence shaping the rhythm of daily life with subtle authority. Servants scurry not just out of duty, but out of an instinctive creeping unease. Imagine entering a home today where every glance from the hostess makes you second-guess yourself, where even the polished silver seems to judge your every move. That's the atmosphere inside the Bathory stronghold. Historians still argue whether the aura of dread surrounding her household was real or amplified by later sensational accounts. Daily routines for the Countess are a careful choreography of appearances, management, and experiments in control. She supervises laundry, meals, and the countless servants' tasks, often arriving unexpectedly to inspect, correct, or simply observe. There's a fringe anecdote claiming she would occasionally release bees into the hallways to test how quickly her staff could respond, though it's unclear whether this was mischievous play or an early test of fear and obedience. Visitors describe the castle's interior as ornate but cold. Tapestries depicting battle scenes, heavy wooden furniture, and a persistent scent of herbs mixed with candle smoke. Elizabeth enjoys the juxtaposition, a sensory reminder that beauty and danger can coexist in the same space. Rumors begin to stir in nearby villages, carried by merchants and curious nobility. At first, they are whispered tales of strange rituals or odd punishments for minor mistakes. Perhaps a servant disappeared for a week, or a guest left the castle with an unusual bruise, prompting quiet speculation. Elizabeth's penchant for bathing, always in a perfume-infused tub, is frequently mentioned in these rumors, some claiming she added odd ingredients like powdered gems or blood to the water. Fringe historians debate whether these tales were exaggerations intended to elevate her mystique or rooted in actual obsessive practices. Meanwhile, the social scene of the castle is a mixture of feasts, political maneuvering, and subtle intimidation. Nobles who come to visit must navigate Elizabeth's keen gaze and unpredictable moods, balancing flattery with caution. Servants, often pulled from nearby villages, carry out endless chores under the shadow of her presence, whispering about the Countess' latest whims. One quirky account suggests she had a miniature dungeon set up purely for rehearsal purposes, a place to time how long someone could endure confinement, though it's unclear if this was serious or a cruel joke. Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, is frequently absent, leaving her with near total control over her domains. She uses this power to exert influence over her surroundings and to indulge in small experiments of dominance. A mainstream historical fact notes that she oversaw a substantial estate in addition to the castle, managing finances, legal affairs, and the welfare of her tenants. Yet her approach is meticulous and sometimes intimidating. Her fascination with control extends to animals as well. Letters suggest she would test the agility of horses and dogs, perhaps as a harmless pastime, perhaps as a reflection of her need to dominate. Despite outward appearances of an elegant and hospitable noblewoman, Csejthe Castle becomes a crucible for tension. Servants learn quickly that disobedience or perceived incompetence can lead to unpredictable consequences. Neighborhood rumors intensify, fueled by hearsay and fear, creating a feedback loop that heightens Elizabeth's reputation. Some visitors report unnerving sights, a servant trembling under scrutiny, or Elizabeth walking through the halls with the air of someone who measures everyone and everything against an invisible standard. Historians still argue whether these accounts exaggerate reality or capture the subtle cruelty that would later define her legend. Her routines reveal contradictions. She is charitable in public, known for funding local churches and supporting the community. Yet her private life hints at an obsession with control, perfection, and perhaps experimentation. A fringe account describes her as collecting rare herbs and concocting strange potions for baths, seemingly to preserve youth, a practice that will echo in later tales of her bathing in blood. While some dismiss these stories as fanciful embellishments, others note that aristocratic obsessions with beauty and longevity were far from uncommon, leaving room for doubt about the veracity of these darker claims. Even as whispers grow louder, Elizabeth maintains her public persona with unshakable poise. She entertains guests with grace, manages her household with efficiency, and maintains an image of aristocratic elegance. Yet the servants know a different truth. Every corner of the castle is under her scrutiny, every delay or misstep noticed. It's an environment that fosters fear and obedience, subtly conditioning those around her to anticipate and react to her moods. One quirky but recurring rumor mentions her fascination with mirrors, claiming she would sometimes watch reflections of servants performing tasks to note flaws and inefficiencies, a minor obsession that reinforces the narrative of control. As months pass, the castle itself becomes a character in the story. Its corridors, echoing halls, and shadowed corners amplify Elizabeth's presence and the tension within her household. Visitors leave with stories, servants murmur among themselves, and nearby villagers add details to the growing legend of the Countess who rules from a misty fortress with eyes that see everything. Historians still argue whether these early observations of her behavior are the origin of the Blood Countess myth or simply the natural product of a powerful woman asserting authority in a male-dominated society. And just when you think you've grasped the ordinary life of a noblewoman, the whispers escalate and the corridors darken. Something about the castle encourages imagination to twist reality, to make the mundane seem ominous. The stage is set, not just for the stories that will terrify later generations, but for Elizabeth herself to step fully into the shadow of legend, a transformation that turns the ordinary halls of Csejthe Castle into the stage for acts so unsettling that they will blur the line between historical fact and enduring myth. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth Bathory has settled into a rhythm of both privilege and paranoia, the boundaries between daily routines and obsession blurring in ways that even servants notice. The castle, now fully her domain in Ferenc Nadasdy's frequent absences, becomes a theater where she experiments with power, perception, and control. Rumors begin to spread of her peculiar predilections, some rooted in fact, others exaggerated by fear and gossip. Historians still argue whether the tales of her alleged crimes were politically motivated slanders aimed at diminishing her family's influence or reflections of a genuine descent into cruelty. The escalation reportedly begins with small private acts of domination, servants forced to obey her most arbitrary commands, minor punishments that seem almost playful to an outside observer. Fringe anecdotes suggest she would mark servants with a coin or ribbon for failing tasks or misstepping, later escalating to more elaborate tests of obedience. While some historians argue these stories were embellished to create a sensational image, the consistency of reports over decades has ensured their persistence in folklore. It's the kind of behavior that, if viewed from a modern perspective, would land her in a managerial ethics seminar instead of the annals of infamy. Elizabeth's fascination with youth and beauty begins to dominate her narrative. One mainstream historical fact notes that she frequently surrounded herself with young girls, ostensibly for domestic work and education, though rumors whisper of darker motivations. Some fringe reports claim she believed that bathing in their blood could preserve her own vitality, a notion both bizarre and sensational, yet compelling enough to fuel the legend of the Blood Countess. Historians still argue whether these practices actually occurred or were the product of rumor and the eager pens of chroniclers seeking shock value. Within the castle, the atmosphere grows increasingly tense. Servants whisper about missing girls or sudden disappearances. Neighbors murmur about odd sounds at night. and couriers passing through the area hint at encounters with the Countess that are difficult to categorize, frightening, yet oddly alluring. One quirky detail claims she kept a small tower locked and off-limits, which local legend later inflates into a dungeon of horrors, though contemporary records offer only vague mentions of restricted spaces in her household. The ambiguity itself fuels fascination. What is known is overshadowed by speculation. Despite, or perhaps because of, the rumors, Elizabeth maintains an outwardly impeccable household. Feasts, hunts, and social events continue, offering her opportunities to mingle with other nobles while reinforcing the aura of omnipotence at home. Guests report her elegance, intelligence, and charm, a combination that confounds the terrifying stories circulating outside the castle walls. Her duality, a woman capable of both remarkable grace and rumored depravity, sets the stage for a legend that blends reality and imagination in ways few historical figures can match. Some contemporaneous letters suggest that Ferenc Nadasdy, when home, was unaware of or willfully ignorant of the extent of Elizabeth's actions. It's possible he perceived minor eccentricities as harmless, or perhaps he, like others, accepted that power often manifests in unusual forms when exercised by someone of wealth and rank. One quirky anecdote even claims that Nadasdy was impressed by Elizabeth's managerial acumen, oblivious to, or dismissive of, the growing pattern of intimidation and fear in her household. Historians still argue whether his absence facilitated her alleged crimes, or if these tales are exaggerations born from a misogynistic society eager to demonize a powerful woman. Rumors of her cruelty extend beyond the castle as well. Servants fleeing the estate tell lurid tales to the nearby villages, girls disappearing, mysterious injuries, and whispers of blood-soaked baths. Some fringe historians speculate that these stories are a reflection of a cultural obsession with female aristocratic transgression. Women wielding power in ways society could not easily control often became subjects of mythologized horror. Even within her household, subtle acts of defiance or mistakes by servants are said to provoke disproportionate reactions, fostering fear that ensures compliance. The psychological dynamics of Csejthe Castle become almost theatrical. Elizabeth's fascination with control, observation, and perfection escalates, yet remains cloaked beneath layers of nobility and propriety. One quirky detail from local lore mentions that she would occasionally stage mock trials within the household, judging servants for imagined offenses in ways that are equal parts bizarre and instructional, though evidence is sparse. Historians still argue whether these accounts were dramatizations or reflected genuine practices that set her apart from her contemporaries. By now, the line between legend and historical reality is increasingly blurred. The Countess's name circulates in courtly gossip and peasant whispers alike, sometimes evoking admiration for her authority, sometimes horror at her alleged deeds. Her methods, whether real, exaggerated, or imagined, create a narrative of control, obsession, and fascination with life, youth, and mortality that fascinates and terrifies simultaneously. It is this duality that ensures her story endures, capturing imaginations centuries later. And as the shadows lengthen over Csejthe Castle, the first serious reports of her so-called crimes begin to reach authorities. The whispered anecdotes that once seemed innocuous are now dangerous, and Elizabeth Bathory's calculated dominance is poised to meet the scrutiny that will eventually force her into the historical spotlight, leaving a question hanging over her legacy. What really happened behind those cold stone walls, and how much of the horror is legend? By the turn of the 1590s, Elizabeth Bathory's reputation has metastasized into a shadow looming over much of Hungary and Slovakia. Reports reach the king's court, some through careful observation by neighbors, others through servants desperate to escape. The tales are dizzying in their variety: missing girls, mysterious bruises, unusual bathing rituals. Historians still argue whether the accusations were politically motivated attacks intended to curb her family's influence or the first record of a real pattern of abuse. Regardless, the stories travel faster than she ever could, and the Countess's name begins to mean something chilling beyond the walls of Csejthe Castle. Legal inquiries begin in a world where the law itself is a strange mixture of feudal custom and evolving royal authority. King Matthias II eventually receives reports from concerned nobles, prompting the dispatch of investigators. What's remarkable and terrifying is that Elizabeth's trial was unique for its time. She was not immediately executed. Instead, the process involved detailed witness testimonies, searches of her chambers, and interrogations that exposed the peculiar and obsessive routines she had cultivated over decades. Fringe historians note that her interrogation may have been influenced by gendered expectations, a suspicion that powerful women were inherently prone to cruelty, but documents show her household was indeed unusually controlled and secretive. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Elizabeth maintains her composure with a cold, almost mechanical precision. Servants whisper of increased surveillance, new restrictions, and unusual punishments for minor errors. One quirky rumor suggests she kept a diary of infractions, noting mistakes with meticulous detail, as if compiling an instruction manual on fear. Historians still argue whether this practice existed or is a modern projection of her obsessive tendencies onto the surviving accounts. Regardless, the reports paint a picture of a woman exercising authority in ways that terrified both the lower ranks and visiting nobility. The trial proceedings, however, are conducted with caution. Nobles fear both the Countess's wealth and the scandal of appearing weak in the face of potential impropriety. Witnesses include servants and villagers, each describing unsettling events, sudden disappearances, bruises, and even whispered accounts of blood rituals. While some reports veer into the grotesque, others are mundane, yet still suggestive of strict, sometimes cruel control. One mainstream historical fact notes that the king's representatives documented at least 21 separate accusations, many involving unusual treatment of servants and young women under her care, though the more sensational tales of bathing in blood remain debated. Elizabeth herself is reportedly defiant, a figure of aristocratic entitlement who alternates between charm and menace. Her personal letters, some preserved, show a woman keenly aware of her reputation, sometimes defensive, sometimes dismissive, yet always commanding in tone. She appears to understand that public perception is both weapon and shield, and she wields it carefully. One fringe account claims she used mirrors to observe her staff, even during investigations, a symbolic act of control that may or may not have occurred. Historians still argue whether her conduct was the mark of cruelty or simply a reflection of aristocratic detachment and obsession with order. Outside the castle, the legend swells. Local populations treat her name with awe and fear, embellishing stories in ways that often exceed reality. Villagers report eerie sights, long shadows in the windows, children disappearing briefly from view, unexplained bruises. Quirky anecdotes emerge that she kept an entourage of cats, believing their presence would absorb bad luck or spy on the timid servants. A detail so strange it seems almost invented, yet appears repeatedly in folklore. Scholars note that these tales likely reflect social anxiety about power, gender, and mortality more than literal evidence of violence. When the royal investigators finally confront her, the tension is cinematic. Elizabeth is said to have received them with dignity, offering hospitality while subtly asserting dominance over the proceedings. The interrogations continue over weeks, each question met with evasive elegance, occasional misdirection, and a keen awareness of how every word might be used against her. Witnesses speak of incidents in vivid, unsettling detail, sometimes inconsistent, yet terrifyingly persuasive. Historians still argue whether these contradictions indicate invention, fear-induced error, or real events that defied comprehension. Ultimately, the evidence, rumor, and testimony coalesce into an unavoidable conclusion for the court. Elizabeth Bathory has created an environment of fear, obsession, and harm. The severity of the accusations, coupled with her social standing, leaves authorities with a complex problem: how to punish a powerful woman without causing political upheaval. One quirky detail claims that she was confined not in a traditional cell, but in a room fortified with iron and sealed windows monitored around the clock. A curious combination of punishment and protection, illustrating the court's ambivalence toward her. In the shadows of the castle, her servants watch the unfolding drama with barely concealed relief and lingering terror. The fortress that once amplified her control now becomes a gilded cage. Yet even in confinement, Elizabeth remains a figure of fascination, her methods and personality continuing to blur the line between historical fact and legend. Historians still argue whether her confinement marked the end of her influence or simply codified the mythology that had already taken root. As the first heavy winter descends, the walls of Csejthe Castle seem to exhale centuries of tension, secrets, and whispered stories. Outside, villagers speak her name with caution, while inside, the Countess contemplates her legacy and her obsessions, aware that history is watching. And in this suspended moment, the final chapters of her life and the legend that will endure for centuries hover just beyond reach, ready to reveal the darker truths lurking beneath the tales. The final years of Elizabeth Bathory's life unfold within the stony, iron-barred confinement of Csejthe Castle, a place once the stage for her dominance now transformed into her prison. She is largely isolated, permitted only the presence of a few loyal attendants who serve more out of duty than affection, as fear and obedience mingle. Her movements are restricted, yet she remains a figure of quiet, eerie authority. Historical accounts note that she lived in these conditions for the last 4 years of her life, under constant surveillance but never formally executed, a decision reflecting both her social rank and the political delicacy of punishing a woman of noble birth. Historians still argue whether this leniency was a form of mercy, a political compromise, or an acknowledgement of the fragile balance between law and aristocratic privilege. Within these walls, Elizabeth's obsessions linger. Even in confinement, her fascination with control, appearances, and ritualistic routines persists, albeit in muted forms. One quirky anecdote claims she kept small animals in her room, perhaps as companions, perhaps as tools for maintaining the illusion of power over life itself. Servants report her continuing to write letters with an elegance that contrasts sharply with her tarnished reputation, conveying thoughts of politics, philosophy, and occasionally defensive justifications of her past actions. The juxtaposition of her refinement and the gravity of her crimes, or alleged crimes, makes her story all the more compelling and unsettling. Outside the castle, the legend of the Blood Countess continues to grow, fueled by a mix of fact, embellishment, and pure imagination. Rumors circulate in nearby villages, glimpses of her at upper windows, eerie lights, and stories of a woman who, even in confinement, seemed to manipulate fate itself. Some fringe reports suggest that local children were forbidden from approaching the castle grounds, not solely for their safety, but also because adults feared the sheer aura of the woman inside might instill lasting terror. Historians still argue whether these accounts are reliable or simply the cultural echo of a society fascinated by female power and transgression. Despite her physical isolation, Elizabeth maintains a psychological grip on those around her. Servants whisper of her ever-watchful gaze, the subtle ways she reminds them that, even behind locked doors, she is the mistress of her world. Her intellect and charm, previously tools of social maneuvering, become instruments of silent domination, ensuring compliance even when her authority is technically curtailed. One quirky detail notes that she insisted on precise daily routines, arranging her room and surroundings with exacting standards that must have seemed absurdly meticulous to anyone forced to maintain them. This adherence to ritual may hint at a compulsion born from fear, a reflection of anxiety, or simply the last vestige of her desire for order and control. As her confinement stretches into the final years of her life, Elizabeth's story intersects with broader historical currents. Hungary and its surrounding regions are shifting politically, religiously, and culturally, and the name of the Blood Countess is invoked as cautionary folklore, political allegory, and sensational gossip alike. Mainstream records emphasize her lineage, wealth, and the extraordinary measures taken to contain her, while the more sensational tales of bloodbaths and torture feed the growing mythos surrounding her persona. Scholars debate which elements reflect her actual behavior and which reflect societal anxieties projected onto an enigmatic, powerful woman. The closing months are marked by increasing frailty and introspection. Elizabeth's attendants note a shift in demeanor, moments of quiet reflection punctuated by sharp, occasional irritability. In these moments, the Countess embodies both human vulnerability and the enduring mystique that has fueled centuries of legend. One quirky anecdote mentions her fascination with mirrors, reportedly observing her own reflection with a curiosity bordering on superstition, as if seeking understanding or perhaps reconciliation with the figure history is crafting from her life. When Elizabeth Bathory finally dies in 1614, she leaves behind a story that will outlive her physical presence by centuries. Her life and legend intertwine in ways that defy easy separation. A noblewoman whose status insulated her from immediate consequences, a figure whose obsessions have been sensationalized, yet whose psychological depth remains compelling. The castle, the servants, the witnesses, all contribute to a narrative that spans reality and imagination, fact and folklore. Historians still argue whether she was a deliberate criminal, a misunderstood aristocrat, or a vessel for the anxieties of a patriarchal society confronted with female authority. Her legacy endures in modern culture with an intensity few historical figures experience. Movies, books, documentaries, and folklore continue to explore her life, often emphasizing the most lurid aspects while scholars attempt to parse evidence from myth. Fringe stories, from alleged magical practices to eccentric rituals, persist alongside documented facts of her wealth, influence, and confinement. Elizabeth Bathory becomes less a person and more a symbol of the extremes of human obsession, of the fear of unchecked power, and of the dark fascination that history and storytelling impose on extraordinary lives. As the centuries pass, Csejthe Castle remains a silent witness to the story of Elizabeth Bathory. Visitors are drawn to its crumbling walls, curious about the echoes of a life both real and imagined. Some swear they feel a presence in the shadows, a reminder of the woman whose name has become synonymous with horror and intrigue. The final whispers of her legend continue to captivate, challenging the listener to consider the nature of cruelty, power, and how stories shape memory. And while the doors of history close on her lifetime, the unanswered question lingers. How much of the terror was hers, and how much was ours to imagine? Now, let the pace slow, and picture Csejthe Castle in the stillness of winter, its stone walls heavy with centuries of memory. The shadows that once pressed in so oppressively now soften under the pale, gentle light, the echoes of long-ago footsteps replaced by the quiet breath of time itself. Elizabeth Bathory, once the center of whispered terror, no longer stands as a symbol of fear, but as a human caught between legend and mortality. Her obsessions, her meticulous habits, her whispered commands, all fade into the calm, leaving only the reflection of a life lived with intensity and consequences that few could imagine. Here, we linger not in fear, but in contemplation. The dark edges of her story, the eerie details that once made villages shiver, now serve as mirrors of human behavior and society. They remind us that history is never only events. It is also the stories we choose to remember, the anxieties we project, and the fascination we hold for the extraordinary. The whispers of her servants, the rumors that spread across towns, the official reports sent to kings, all blend into a tapestry stretched across centuries, revealing that history is as much about narrative as it is about fact. Take a slow breath and let the image soften further. The cold stone of the castle warmed by the faint pink light of dawn, Elizabeth's name fading from terror into the distance, leaving only curiosity, reflection, and a gentle understanding of human complexity. Time eases the sharp edges of legend, showing us that every story, even one steeped in horror, is also about people, society, and imagination. What seemed monstrous in her life can now be observed as a mix of ambition, fear, ritual, and the peculiarities of human psychology. In this quiet, the castle, the walls, the shadows, and the name of the Blood Countess all yield to stillness. The dark fascination that once gripped imaginations softens, replaced by a sense of calm reflection. The story continues to linger, but it is no longer an immediate threat. It is an invitation to think, to wonder, and to remember that legends, even the most terrifying, are shaped as much by the observers as by the observed. And as you slowly close your eyes, imagine leaving the castle, walking through the snow-covered path, the wind whispering through the ancient walls, reminding you that history is full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The next bedtime history journey will take you somewhere equally strange, where shadows and stories merge, where truth and myth intertwine in ways that spark curiosity and quiet fascination. Let that image drift across your mind, breathe out, and let your thoughts settle into peace. The ghosts of the past, the legends and dark tales, now linger only as a gentle mist surrounding your mind, reminding you that sometimes silence and reflection can be far more powerful than the stories themselves.